Two men both called him boss. One stayed loyal for 50 years. The other tried to steal his empire the moment he left the country. February 1946, Lucky Luciano stood on the deck of the SS Laura Keene, watching the Manhattan skyline fade into the distance. He was being deported to Italy, forcibly removed from the only country he'd ever called home. His criminal empire, the structures he'd built, the families he'd organized, the commission he'd created, all of it remained in New York while he sailed to permanent exile. Before leaving, he'd made careful arrangements. Meyer Lansky would protect his financial interests. Frank Costello would represent him in commission meetings. And Vito Genovese, his trusted lieutenant and friend, would help maintain his influence within the family that bore his name. One of those men kept his word for the rest. His life, the other immediately began plotting to take everything Luciano had built. Vito Genovese's betrayal wasn't just a business move. It was personal. It was a demonstration that in organized crime, even the closest relationships mean nothing when power is up for grabs. And it proved something Meyer Lansky had understood all along. Genuine loyalty is the rarest commodity in a world built on broken promises. But the real story was never only about the betrayal itself. To understand what Genovese did, you need to understand who he was to Luciano. They'd known each other since the 1920s, working together through bootlegging, the Castellammer's War, the creation of the Commission. Genovese had been one of the gunmen who killed Joe Masseria in 1931, the Coney Island restaurant murder that ended the gang war and cleared the path for Luciano's rise. He was capable, ruthless, and completely loyal, or so Luciano believed, but there were warning signs. In 1937, Genovese fled to Italy to avoid a murder charge, living there under Mussolini's protection until after World War II. While in Italy, he ingratiated himself with the fascist government, made money through black market operations, and maintained connections to American organized crime. The war ended and Allied forces occupied Italy. Genovese returned to the United States in 1945, expecting to resume his position in Luciano's organization. The murder charge that drove him to Italy was eventually dismissed. The key witness mysteriously died before trial. Genovese was free, powerful, and ambitious. And when Luciano was deported in 1946, Genovese saw opportunity. The boss was gone, the family needed leadership, and Genovese believed he deserved to be that leader. What happened next changed the meaning of everything that came before. Luciano's deportation created a power vacuum. Technically, the family still belonged to Luciano. His name carried weight. His strategic vision had built the organization. His connections through the commission meant he couldn't simply be pushed aside. But he was in Italy, thousands of miles away, unable to attend meetings, unable to operate the way he had when he was in New York. That distance created opportunity for anyone ambitious enough to exploit it. Genovese started carefully. He didn't immediately declare himself boss or openly challenge Luciano's authority. Instead, he positioned himself as the natural choice to manage the family's day-to-day operations. He attended commission meetings, he made decisions, he built alliances, and slowly, subtly, he began acting less like a caretaker and more like the actual boss. Frank Costello, who Luciano had designated as his representative, found himself increasingly sidelined. Genovese cultivated relationships with younger, more violent members of the family who respected power over loyalty. He made moves without consulting Luciano. He kept profits that should have been shared, and he started talking about the family as if it were his, not Luciano's. Meyer Lansky watched all of this happen and reported back to Luciano in Italy. The contrast between Genovese and Lansky couldn't have been starker. Lansky maintained absolute loyalty to Luciano despite the exile. He protected Luciano's money, represented his interests, and never once considered using the deportation as an opportunity for personal gain. Genovese did the opposite. He saw exile as weakness and moved to exploit it. The confidence in his presence did not mean certainty existed within him. Imagine being Lucky Luciano in Italy, receiving reports about Genovese's betrayal. You're in exile, legally barred from returning to America, watching from across an ocean as someone you trusted tries to steal what you built. You can send messages, you can make phone calls, you can express displeasure through intermediaries. But you can't walk into a room and remind everyone who actually runs things. You can't use physical presence to assert authority. You can't rely on the charisma and force of personality that made you powerful in the first place. That's the unique torture of exile for a crime boss. Power in organized crime isn't just about money or title. It's about presence, respect, and the ability to personally enforce your will. From Italy, Luciano had influence but not control, and Genovese understood that distinction perfectly. The power struggle played out over years, not days. Genovese couldn't simply declare himself boss; that would have violated commission rules and invited retaliation. Instead, he eroded Luciano's authority gradually. He made himself indispensable to the family's operations. He built loyalty among soldiers who'd never met Luciano personally and only knew him as a name from the past. He cultivated relationships with other commission members, presenting himself as the future while Luciano represented the past. But there was something no one around him could fully understand. Luciano wasn't powerless. He was distant but not defeated. He still had Meyer Lansky completely loyal. He still had connections throughout the underworld. He still had the strategic mind that had built modern organized crime, and he still had enough respect within the commission that Genovese couldn't simply ignore him. The counterattack came through careful manipulation. Luciano couldn't remove Genovese directly; he lacked the physical presence to make that happen. But he could undermine Genovese's power base, strengthen his own allies, and create situations where Genovese's ambition became a liability rather than an asset. Through Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, Luciano worked to maintain his influence. Messages flowed between Italy and New York constantly. Decisions that affected the family were still run past Luciano, even if Genovese tried to circumvent that process. Money continued to flow to Italy, ensuring Luciano remained financially powerful even in exile. And most importantly, Luciano never stopped, reminding the commission that the structures they relied on, the organization, the rules, the cooperation, all came from him. Genovese's fatal mistake was overreach. In 1957, he called the Appalachian Meeting, a gathering of major crime figures in upstate New York that was raided by police, exposing the national scope of organized crime and embarrassing everyone involved. The meeting was meant to demonstrate Genovese's power, his ability to summon bosses the way Luciano once had. Instead, it became a disaster that brought unwanted law enforcement attention. Luciano, watching from Italy, must have felt vindicated. Genovese had proven he wasn't smart enough to replace the man he was trying to betray. He built a world that looked controlled, even while carrying burdens no one could see. The final blow came in 1959 when Genovese was convicted on narcotics charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The case was built on testimony from informants and there's speculation that Luciano's allies may have helped set it up. Regardless of whether Luciano was directly involved, the result was clear. Genovese went to prison and his attempt to steal Luciano's empire ended in failure. But by then, both men were diminished. Genovese would die in prison in 1969. Luciano had died in 1962, still in exile, never having returned to America. The power struggle between them didn't produce a clear winner, it just demonstrated how betrayal destroys both the betrayer and the betrayed. The contrast with Meyer Lansky was stark and intentional. While Genovese was plotting to take over, Lansky was protecting Luciano's interests. While Genovese was building independent power, Lansky was maintaining loyalty. While Genovese was treating exile as opportunity, Lansky was treating it as temporary separation from a friend who would eventually need his continued support. Lansky never tried to take over, never exploited Luciano's absence, never stopped representing Luciano's interests as if Luciano were still present. That loyalty wasn't naive or sentimental, it was strategic. Lansky understood that long-term partnerships built on trust were more valuable than short-term power grabs built on betrayal. Genovese never learned that lesson. What people called legendary often began as something deeply personal. The Genovese betrayal wounded Luciano in ways that went beyond business. This wasn't just someone trying to steal money or territory. This was someone Luciano had trusted, worked with for decades, relied on as a friend. The betrayal was personal because the relationship had been personal, and that's what made it hurt worse than any business dispute could. Luciano had faced betrayals before. He'd orchestrated them himself, the Masseria murder, the Maranzano assassination. But those were strategic eliminations of people who stood in the way of progress. Genovese's betrayal was different. It came from inside the inner circle, from someone who'd benefited from Luciano's trust and then exploited that trust the moment Luciano couldn't physically defend himself. it also revealed something uncomfortable about organized crime loyalty. The structures Luciano built were impressive. The commission worked, the rules reduced violence, the cooperation increased profits, but none of that changed human nature. When power was available, ambitious men took it. When weakness appeared, predators attacked. The formal structures couldn't fully substitute for personal presence and the respect that came from it. Meyer Lansky proved that loyalty was possible, but Vito Genovese proved that loyalty was rare, and the difference between them illustrated why Luciano valued Lansky so highly. In a world where almost everyone would betray you given the chance, finding someone who wouldn't was priceless. The image was real, so was the silence afterward. The power struggle between Luciano and Genovese never became public in the way some mob conflicts did. There were no headlines about their dispute, no public accusations, no dramatic confrontations that made newspapers. The whole thing played out in coded conversations, commission meetings, and subtle manipulations that only insiders understood. That silence was strategic. Both men knew that open conflict would weaken the family and invite law enforcement attention. So they fought through proxies, allies, and careful political maneuvering. Genovese tried to consolidate power while maintaining plausible respect for Luciano. Luciano tried to limit Genovese's influence while accepting that from exile his options were constrained. But everyone in the underworld knew what was happening. They saw Genovese's ambition. They saw Luciano's frustration. They saw Meyer Lansky's loyalty. And they drew their own conclusions about which model to follow, the betrayer who reached for power or the loyalist who maintained partnership. History suggests loyalty was the better long-term strategy. Genovese ended up in prison. His family eventually passed to other hands. His reputation became synonymous with betrayal and overreach. Meanwhile, Meyer Lansky died free in 1983. At age 80, having maintained respect and influence throughout his life without ever betraying the friend who trusted him. Many knew the legend, the exile who lost his empire, the trusted lieutenant who turned traitor, the loyal friend who never wavered. But very few understood the hunger that drove each choice. Genovese hungry for power, willing to betray friendship to seize it. Lansky hungry for stability, recognizing that long-term loyalty was more valuable than short-term gain. Luciano hungry for respect, watching from exile as betrayal and loyalty revealed their true costs. That hunger came from somewhere much deeper. For Genovese, it came from believing that exile meant weakness and weakness meant opportunity. For Lansky, it came from understanding that true power isn't about seizing every opportunity, it's about building relationships that outlast circumstance. For Luciano, it came from learning the hard way that the structures you build can survive your absence, but the loyalty you inspire depends on the character of the people you trusted. The real story was never only about who won the power struggle. It was about what the struggle revealed. That loyalty is rare because betrayal is easy. That distance tests relationships in ways proximity never can. That the formal structures of organization mean little when personal ambition overrides them. And most importantly, that the difference between someone like Vito Genovese and someone like Meyer Lansky is the difference between short-term calculation and long-term commitment. Lucky Luciano built an empire that survived his imprisonment and his exile. The commission he created continued to function. The families he organized maintained. Cooperation, the rules he established reduced violence. All of that demonstrated his genius as an organizer and strategist. But he couldn't build loyalty into people who didn't possess it naturally. He couldn't create character through structure. He couldn't guarantee that the people he trusted would stay trustworthy when circumstances changed. Vito Genovese proved that. Meyer Lansky proved the opposite, that genuine loyalty exists, but finding it requires extraordinary judgment and luck. The confidence in their presence did not mean certainty existed within them. When you study the Luciano-Genovese conflict alongside the Luciano-Lansky partnership, you see organized crime's fundamental tension. The business requires cooperation, but human nature drives competition. The structures work when people follow them, but ambition breaks them. Luciano understood this. He'd built the commission because formal structures could channel ambition productively, but structures alone weren't enough. You needed people who believed in them, who saw long-term value in cooperation, who could resist temptation to betray. Genovese proved not everyone possessed that discipline. Lansky proved some people did. The tragedy was Luciano needed more Lanskys and got people like Genovese. The exile made everything worse. If Luciano had been in New York, Genovese never would have attempted the betrayal. Physical presence matters in power structures. From Italy, Luciano could maintain influence but not dominance. He could express disapproval but not enforce consequences. That limitation was why deportation hurt. It removed him from the power structure in ways that invited betrayal from people who should have stayed. Loyal Meyer Lansky didn't need Luciano's physical presence to maintain loyalty. He didn't need threat of retaliation. He stayed loyal because loyalty was who he was. That character-based loyalty is what Luciano needed. Genovese's betrayal showed how rare it was. In the end, both Luciano and Genovese lost. Luciano died in exile, never reclaiming the physical control he'd once possessed. Genovese died in prison, his ambitions destroyed by the same legal system that had deported Luciano. The only winner was Meyer Lansky, who maintained his partnerships, his influence, and his freedom until natural death took him decades later. That outcome suggests something important about organized crime loyalty. Betrayal might offer short-term gains, but it creates long-term vulnerabilities. Loyalty might seem expensive in the moment, but it builds relationships that survive setbacks and distance. The betrayer ends up isolated, always watching for the next person who will do to them what they did to others. The loyalist builds networks of trust that endure. Vito Genovese tried to steal an empire and ended up in prison. Meyer Lansky maintained a friendship and died wealthy and respected. Lucky Luciano lost both men in different ways, one to betrayal, one to the separation of exile, but only one of those losses was chosen by the person who caused it. The lesson is uncomfortable because it's so clear. In a world built on betrayal, the betrayers don't win. The survivors are the ones who figure out loyalty, maintain it against all incentives to break it, and build relationships strong enough to outlast the circumstances that test them. Lucky Luciano learned that lesson too late to prevent Genovese's betrayal, but he learned it well enough to appreciate Meyer Lansky's loyalty for what it was, the rarest and most valuable thing in organized crime. Not just rare because few people possessed it, rare because the world made it almost impossible to sustain. Vito Genovese proved loyalty was hard, Meyer Lansky proved it was possible, and Lucky Luciano, watching from exile as betrayal and loyalty played out in the empire he'd built, learned that the difference between them was everything.